Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this installment of our series of lectures for Music 110 Introduction to Audio Technology. Today, I'm going to be talking about two things. I want to talk about mixing, and I want to talk about MIDI files. So, the first topic, which is going to be about mixing multiple tracks, is really about helping you all as you work towards your finalizing your final projects, in dealing with musical materials that are happening in multiple tracks simultaneously, and trying to create space for each of those tracks so that the sounds come through clearly and we can really hear all of the relationships between all the layers. So this will be a very sort of this will be an introduction to different ways of thinking about mixing. After that, I will be talking about MIDI files and how with MIDI we can communicate across platforms. In other words, how MIDI isn't just about connecting multiple devices to work in real time with one another. In other words, you've got a drum machine, a computer, a keyboard, and they all, because of the way that MIDI works, they're all able to synchronize and communicate very efficiently. Not only does that allow us to do that sort of musically in real time, but MIDI also is very effective at communicating between DAWs, digital audio workstations, and notation software. So I'm going to be talking about how MIDI files, the information that gets written to file when you export your MIDI composition, can easily be opened in a number of applications, and so there's a lot that's this is one other aspect of MIDI that makes it very powerful, the way that it can be transferred across different platforms, from instrument to instrument, from software to software, even from different graphical representations to other ones. So hopefully this will be a rather short lecture tonight. Really, I'm just going to go through some very basic ideas about mixing and just strategies when you're dealing with a bunch of layers. And then I'll kind of talk about the relationship between MIDI and music notation, and how the MIDI language works so smoothly with musical notation software. So to get started, we're going to be talking about mixing. Now, the art of mixing is really about, and if you could see me in person, you'd see that I was putting scare quotes around what I'm about to say, giving each voice its own space within the mix, and I would be putting scare quotes around space. So when we're talking about space in relation to mixing recorded music, clearly we're not talking about the space in the room where you are sitting when you're listening to the music. It is the space within the mix itself. And that space we can think of three-dimensionally. So there is the left to right dimension, and so this we're going to manipulate with panning. So when we have multiple tracks going on, we can pan one to the left and one to the right, and that really can clarify the difference between them and help us to hear them more clearly as individual components. So that's the left to right. There is the forward and back, or closer and further away. And in mixing, we can do this with changes in volume. You could also say, if you add reverb, it makes things sound further away. But we're just talking about mixing and the ways that we can create these different senses of dimensionality. So, the louder something is, the closer it's going to appear. The quieter something is, the further away it's going to appear in relation to other elements in the music. So that is our sort of foreground, background, close and far, near and far. So that is, and then the other dimensionality is high and low. And when we're thinking about high and low, I want us to be thinking in terms of frequency or pitch. And that if we give each element of our mix its own notch on the high to low spectrum, then we can hear the elements more clearly. So oftentimes mixing is about saying, okay, well, let's give the guitar this band within the frequency spectrum. So if we're thinking in terms of frequency, maybe the band would be, okay, so let's let the guitar really sit in between 200 hertz and 2000 hertz or something like that. Then the bass would really be able to occupy the frequency band below that, et cetera, et cetera. So you're thinking about how each element gets its own little spot. So if the mix, the whole mix is a tree, and each track that you have gets its own little tree house on that tree, then you might say, okay, well, the bass is in the bottom tree house. The guitar is somewhere in the middle. Maybe the flutes are on top. And thinking about giving each voice its own little band, its own little part of the frequency spectrum, can help you to differentiate the layers. As we'll see, sometimes it almost seems counterintuitive, like when you're mixing, particularly like mixing like a heavy rock record, like a heavy metal record or something. It might seem counterintuitive to take out a lot of the bass frequencies from the guitars, but it actually improves the mix. All right, so we're going to be looking at changing volume of different tracks. We're going to be looking at changing panning on different tracks, and we're going to be looking at using a filter to give each track its own space in the mix. That's it. So in order to sort of do this, I'm just going to pull over some random MIDI or music loops here from my browser, and like I said, I'm just pulling stuff over at random, but I want to have something like a band sound. So right now, so far, I have like this some like strings, and I've got a percussion, a drum set sort of thing. Let's see if I can find. So this will be my bass line. And so I've got percussion, strings, a bass line. Maybe I'll throw in some sort of keyboard. Let's see what we got here. Well, maybe this will work. Like I said, I'm just dragging over random stuff. So, I'm gonna play what I have so far just from these random loops real quick, and then and maybe not even listen to the whole thing, because I think probably immediately we'll notice we've got some mix problems. Okay, just by listening to that, I can already tell that we've got some work to do. It's muddy. The percussion is masking a lot of the other sounds. There's not a lot of high frequency other than that shaker. So let's just kind of go through and listen to each of these tracks by themselves. So that's the string part. All right, that's the percussion part. And that's the bass line. So one thing that I noticed right away is that our classic synth line that we just listened to and the string section is kind of in the same range, kind of in the same treehouse. So if I play these at the same time. So a lot of our muddiness is really coming from them sharing the same space. So there are a couple of things we could do. First off, we could try our left-right, our left-right approach. So let's see. So I'm going to use some panning now to try to differentiate these two lines. Okay, so that helps a little bit. I still think that it's like this is a little bit too muddy. There are a couple of things that that are still available to me. Now, this is just because this is MIDI. If we were dealing with audio, I would not be able to do this trick. But one thing I can do because I'm using MIDI here is all of these MIDI notes are movable. So, for instance, the way that the pitches are working together is fine by me. It all seems like it's in the same key. But if I listen to these two at the same time, they're sharing the same part of the spectrum, and especially it's these lower string notes. So what if I just took them and I moved them up an octave? And I'm going to now returning the panning kind of maybe closer to center for each so we can hear if it's helping with the muddiness. Yeah, I mean that seems to be helping a little bit. I wonder what happens if I mess with this keyboard part in the same way. So what I can do for this keyboard part is grab everything, and what if I were to move this up two octaves? Okay. Okay. I kind of like that, but I'm wondering if now I can take this string part and move it down, really differentiate these two as much as I can. So now I've squashed this string part together a little bit, and I'm moving it down an octave just to see what I've got. So now you can see, even though I have them panned pretty much to the center, you can really hear the difference between these two parts because they're not both in the same range. Now, I wouldn't be able to do this if I was dealing with audio, but I can do this if I'm dealing with MIDI. And so really we're kind of talking more about orchestration than we are talking about mixing. But the premises hold, right? Like, and this is a really easy way for me to demonstrate that if you get each instrument in its own band within the high to low frequency spectrum, they really kind of are much easier to differentiate for us as listeners. So now let's start to incorporate some of these other elements. So, all right, there's way too much percussion. So first off, let's try to put the percussion just like further back in the mix. So I'm gonna start riding these faders and try to make some adjustments here. So yeah, and now just by adjusting these, really what I'm doing as I'm adjusting these faders is I'm really just listening to the relationship between each of these tracks. I'm trying to get it so that there isn't so much percussion just getting in the way. So I've reduced the percussion by much more than the other elements. The bass I've reduced the least. I've only reduced it by a decibel, but I've reduced the percussion by almost 6. So just by doing this sort of very, reducing the percussion by 6 and the others by 2 or 4, then I've already really kind of cleaned up some things here. So. Now, you might have noticed that as I was starting to pan the strings and the keyboard further from the center, that allowed the bass to come out more, the bass part to come out more. It gave it more space in the middle of our left-right spectrum. So it isn't just about making it be like, oh, the strings are in the left, the keyboard's in the right. It isn't just about helping us to hear the difference between the two things that are panned. As soon as you start panning two elements out to the sides, what is in the middle gets a little more space. So it both clarifies the strings and the keyboard and the bass at the same time, because then the bass kind of has this space in the middle of the panning. Okay. So let's see if I can find something. What I'd like to do is find maybe some sort of vocal thing that I can throw in here. So let's see what I can find. And the reason I want to throw in some audio is I want to show you that once you start working with audio, that filtering can be very powerful, very useful. So let's see what we got here. All right, so this is just, I have no idea what this audio is. I'm just going to pull this in from our loops here. And the idea here is just to get a sense of how to mix this all together. So here's what I pulled over. Okay, so now we have this electric guitar thing in here, and it's really kind of it's seeping into our well, it kind of is overlapping our frequency space between the strings and the keyboard. So let's see what we can do about filtering this. And what I'm going to do is throw a channel strip onto this audio here, and and if you remember, this channel strip will offer me a low pass and a high pass filter, or everything below the frequency on the high pass filter will be passed through. Everything above the frequency on the low pass filter will be passed through. So let's see what happens when I start filtering this guitar line and, trying to just give it its little tiny space in between these two parts. Okay, so I think that really helps to clear things up. What I want to do is, well, first let's just listen to this by itself. So I can kind of demonstrate this. Here is what I've done. Here's how I've changed the guitar sound. Now, you might say, man, if we just listen to this guitar sound completely by itself, you made it sound worse. It almost sounds like it's coming out of an old telephone or something. Versus. But the thing is, this guitar has to share the space with all of these other instruments. So I'm going to now play all of this together, and I'll toggle back and forth between having these filters on and off. So really what I've done with this filter is similar to what I was doing with moving MIDI notes around in the string part and the keyboard part. Is I'm just trying to give the guitar its own little space within the mix, and I'm thinking about where that space is in relation to the other instruments, which treehouse I'm trying to put the guitar into. So those are our main sort of categories of mixing. We've looked at panning and how panning can not only help to differentiate between two tracks because one is in the left and the other is in the right. then other than those two tracks that have been panned, the other tracks get their own space in the center. We've looked at using volume to adjust between, to adjust these, to sort of balance the tracks between each other. But we also can think about how volume can give us a sense of closeness for, and distance. If you think back to when the percussion was full volume, it was just so in front. And by bringing down the volume, it kind of lets it recede in the mix a little bit. And that's nice because you get to have the percussion sort of at the back of the stage rather than right up front. And we've looked at the frequency spectrum of the whole mix, trying to put each element in its own band, its own sort of treehouse. So let the bass be the bass, let the guitar be in the middle, let the cymbals be up top. And the reason that we do this is to help to clarify, because when you have instruments in the same range, when you have sounds in the same range, there's a lot of interference between them. So if you think back to when we're thinking about sound as sound pressure waves, and how if you have multiple sounds in the same basic area, a lot of time, same range, they can cancel each other out in ways that you don't necessarily want them to. So by giving each instrument its own little spot, excuse me, the whole mix is a lot easier for us to control. All right, so that kind of takes us through panning, fading, using faders to mix, and thinking about the frequency spectrum while we're mixing. Now to part 2 of today's lecture, which will be how MIDI can be translated from one application, one piece of software, into another. Okay, so right now I've got these music loop files that I've dragged over from our sort of preset browser over here in Studio One, and as we saw, really these are MIDI notes with velocity and duration and note numbers. And so this is one way, as we see here in the MIDI edit window, this is one way to graphically represent this data. So it's on a piano roll, right? And we know that, okay, so MIDI note number, whichever one this is, so whichever MIDI note number this is, play on at right when we start, off at this point in time, on at this point in time, off at this point in time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a graphical representation of on and off messages that are have a velocity number that's connected to them. Or you could think that the off messages are just, it's this note number, velocity 0. This note number, velocity 80, or whatever it is. So this is just one graphical representation of it. It's the piano roll graphical representation of just these numbers. It's just MIDI note numbers and velocity numbers. That's it. And timing. Now, so this information can be translated from one program to another, and this is how you do it in Studio One. So I'm selecting just the MIDI. I'm not selecting the audio because this would not work on audio. It would only work on MIDI. And I'm going to go up to Event, and I'm going to go down to Export Selection. And what this will do is bring up a pop-up window, and this is going to allow me to export this MIDI information. And I'm going to name it as something like MIDI song demo. And I'm going to put this onto my desktop. And I have two options on the type of file that I can export to. That when I write this information to disk, I have two file formats. One is a music loop file, and the other is a MIDI file. They're very similar, but a music loop file can only be opened by Studio One. So music loop file has all of the MIDI information, but it also has Studio One specific information, like this is the Presence synthesizer. Load in the salsa drum kit. Load in the string sound. All of the things that are specific to Studio One and the Presence instrument are included in the music loop file. So, if I were to open this MIDI information in some other program, they wouldn't know what the Presence instrument is because it's not made by Studio One. But there is this universal language of MIDI that can translate across these different programs. So I'm going to write it as a MIDI file instead because I want to open it in another program. All right. So I'm going to say save. So what this has done is it's written a file, a MIDI file, that I can now open in another program. And I'm going to go to use a music notation program. This music notation program is Noteflight. And the reason I'm using this one is because it's free. And if you guys wanted to mess around with it, all you need to do is go online and set up an account. But this trick really will work with pretty much any music notation program. So I'm going to say create, and this should open up a pop-up window for me. And if I select, I'm importing an XML or a MIDI file, I will now choose the file. So as a reminder, think back to my lecture introducing us to melodic writing in MIDI when we were talking about the Somewhere Over the Rainbow melody and the relationship between music notation and MIDI and how MIDI works. That they're actually, especially when we're looking at the piano roll, that they're actually very similar. Well, this also means that how we're thinking about the piano roll as a graphical representation of MIDI information, music notation can be a graphical representation, can become a graphical representation of MIDI information. And we're about to see that as my computer slowly does this. Okay. Now, here I have, remember we had a string track, a percussion track, a bass track, and a keyboard track. And this is what we get. This is what we got in standard music, Western music notation. Remember that when we're looking at MIDI, we're just looking at MIDI note numbers, and MIDI note numbers correlate with different pitches on the piano. So right here, all of this is all of this, what we see here in the music notation is actually very straightforwardly connected to what we were hearing in Studio One, except for the second track, which is the percussion track. So remember, with percussion, it still is MIDI note numbers, and really you're just assigning MIDI note number 1 to the bass drum, 2 to the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If it were a piano, instead of it being a bass drum, it would have been a C sharp or whatever it is. So here, if I play this now, we should hear this. This will be only pianos playing what we were just hearing in Studio One. Oh, I'm impressed that Noteflight actually knew to put our second track into percussion samples. All right, so or someone got a percussion sample in there. I don't know. Huh. I'd have to go through to figure out where that symbol is coming in, but okay. So point being, right? It's the same rhythms, it's the same note numbers as we had in Studio One. It's just you don't have the same instrument, you don't have the same sound programs, the same sound banks. So this is the same rhythmic information, the same melodic information. It's just translated into a different library of sounds. And thinking you can look at this music notation, look back over at Studio One, for instance. Let's open up. So if we look at here is the MIDI piano roll for the string part, and this is the first measure, right? So this right here, this first measure is, if we look at it in terms of music notation, is this measure here. Okay, so that takes us to the end of today. We've talked about mixing, and we've talked about how MIDI can translate note number, because MIDI is in just note numbers and velocities. You can translate not just from one DAW to another. You can translate information from a DAW to another, to a music notation program, a totally different sort of way of handling music. So MIDI is a very useful and powerful language, in the sense that it's so intuitively connected to the way that we think about music. All right, y'all. Well, continue working on your final projects. I look forward to speaking with you next time when we listen to your final projects and brainstorm ideas on how to finish them. And I wish you all a fantastic evening. See you soon.